Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dive into something incredibly massive, literally, one of the most consequential geopolitical shifts of our time. We're talking about the historic blueprints of the 2025 Gaza peace plan and the 2026 US-Iran settlement. We're going to stick strictly to the source texts to see exactly how these ambitious deals are attempting to reshape the entire Middle East.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the historic peace blueprints, then break down the 20-point Gaza plan. After that, we'll look at the fragile realities on the ground, pivot over to the US-Iran settlement, and finally ask the big question, will the peace last? Let's get right into it.
Over 68,000. Before we even touch on the mechanics of diplomacy, you really have to ground yourself in why these negotiations are so urgently needed in the first place. I mean, this number represents the staggering human casualties anchoring the stakes of this whole conflict. Behind every single diplomatic maneuver we're going to talk about today, there is just an immense humanitarian crisis driving this desperate need for a resolution.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the historic peace blueprints, focusing on the mediators and timelines. Now, if we look back at the fall of 2025, the landscape shifted at just breakneck speed. President Donald Trump announced the U.S. proposal on September 29th. And get this, by October 8th, a Phase 1 agreement was reached, with the ceasefire officially taking effect just 2 days later. By the 13th, the initial hostage release was actually already underway. It was an incredibly accelerated timeline. Going from a complex 20-point proposal to an active ceasefire on the ground in a matter of days is just a huge undertaking.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 20-point Gaza plan, where we'll look at the actual mechanics of the ceasefire.
So this plan is structured around a super ambitious two-phase sequence. Phase 1 is basically all about immediate triage, freezing the battle lines, executing hostage and prisoner swaps, and surging desperately needed humanitarian aid into the territory. But Phase 2, that's a massive bureaucratic lift where the real structural changes are supposed to happen. It targets demilitarization, the deployment of an international stabilization force, and setting up a technocratic government led by Palestinian experts. So essentially, Phase 1 is designed to stop the bleeding, while Phase 2 attempts to rebuild the body. Now, you really have to pay attention to these heavily disproportionate exchange ratios for the Phase 1 swap. For every 20 living Israeli hostages released, a staggering 2,000 Palestinian prisoners were to be freed, and that actually includes 250 individuals serving life sentences. Plus, for the return of deceased remains, the ratio was set at 1 Israeli hostage to 15 Palestinians. Seeing this data really highlights the incredibly complex calculations and, frankly, the massive concessions that were required just to get both sides to sign the paper. To manage the so-called day after in Gaza, the blueprint outlined a brand new oversight institution, the Board of Peace. It was designated to be chaired by President Trump and pulled in major international figures like former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. And their mandate? It's honestly colossal. They aren't just there to observe. They're literally responsible for handling the massive funding required for redevelopment, and they have to actively supervise the new Palestinian Technocratic Committee that's supposed to handle day-to-day governance. But here is where things get really tricky. The transition from Phase 1 to Phase 2 hits a massive structural wall. Namely, mutually exclusive demands. Israel's core demand requires the total dismantling of Hamas as both a military and governing entity. Conversely, Hamas demands a complete Israeli military withdrawal and the absolute survival of their influence in the region. So, these fundamentally opposed core goals, they explain exactly why implementing the disarmament protocols in Phase 2 has remained so deeply stalled.
And this exact tension is actually mapped out physically on the ground by what's called the yellow line. This is the strictly defined demarcation line within the Gaza Strip that Israeli forces withdrew to during that initial phase of the ceasefire. Well, almost immediately, this boundary became the physical manifestation of the ceasefire's fragility. It turned into a constant flashpoint for incidents and mutual accusations.
Which brings us to Section 3, fragile realities on the ground, and the friction in implementation.
300. Okay, the ceasefire agreement explicitly mandated that 600 humanitarian aid trucks enter Gaza daily to provide critical relief. But actual deliveries? They dropped to just half that, averaging only about 300 trucks a day. And this drastic reduction wasn't just some logistical hiccup. It was heavily tied to mutual disputes. Israeli restrictions cited delays in the return of hostage remains, while humanitarian organizations cited severe access issues. So the initial ceasefire was immediately tested by a whole series of deadly frictions. Both sides aggressively accused the other of violating the agreement's core tenets. I mean, there were Israeli strikes on targets accused of crossing that yellow line we just talked about. There were severe diplomatic crises over the return of deceased individuals, including Israeli accusations that Hamas was staging fake hostage remains for the Red Cross. And looming over all of this was Israel's hardline demand for Hamas to disarm before they would even consider moving forward to Phase 2.
Now, let's pivot to Section 4, the U.S.-Iran settlement, which marks a massive regional shift. In June of 2026, diplomacy shifted focus with a 14-point memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran. This memo attempts to tackle huge regional stakes, starting with immediate economic goals like reopening the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping, which, as you know, is an absolute choke point vital to the global economy. Crucially, it outlines dismantling Iran's nuclear program, proposes a 60-day ceasefire covering Lebanon, and involves releasing up to $30 billion in frozen Iranian assets. But, and this is a big but, because this is just a memorandum, sources warn it could actually take up to a year to negotiate these points into a truly permanent settlement.
Behind the scenes of this massive geopolitical shift, an alliance of mediators orchestrated the talks, but their roles were pretty distinct. While Egypt and Turkey acted as secondary mediators, assisting in negotiations and pushing for broader Arab reconciliation, it was actually Islamabad and Doha, Pakistan and Qatar, who stepped up as the primary mediators. They played the pivotal, much more active roles during those incredibly critical final phases. And even if a flawless political agreement is reached on paper, the physical world presents immense roadblocks. Dismantling Iran's nuclear program literally requires physically transferring enriched uranium out of the country. The catch? Much of this material is trapped in deep underground storage facilities, and the access routes have been buried under tons of rubble from previous U.S. and Israeli bombing campaigns. Actually, it's a massive, time-consuming, logistical nightmare. The sheer physical absurdity of trying to dig out this nuclear material means no simple signature is going to instantly fix this problem.
All right, which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Will the Peace Last? Let's analyze the longevity here. So the longevity of these blueprints is constantly threatened by deep existential roadblocks. First off, Hamas outright refuses to disarm without ironclad guarantees of a sovereign Palestinian state. In response, Israel threatens to resume full military operations if that disarmament stalls. On top of that, there's significant internal political opposition from Israel's far-right coalition partners who are threatening to just collapse the government over these exact deals. Add in the logistical nightmare of the border peace trying to enforce compliance, plus severe disagreements over whether Lebanon should even be included in the U.S.-Iran deal, and you have a highly volatile, escalating mix.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. When you look at everything we've covered, the heavily disproportionate exchange ratios, the fragility of the yellow line, the stalled Phase 2 implementations, and the literal nightmare of nuclear disarmament logistics, you really have to ask yourself, are these blueprints a true end to the conflicts? Or are they simply a temporary reorganization of a deeply fractured region? Thank you so much for joining me as we mapped all this out today and keep questioning the realities behind the headlines.